So my first question, how did the idea of the Virgin's Baby come about?
It was really an accident, this book. I was thinking of doing an anthology of journalists' memoirs. When journalists retire, hacks put out to pasture, they often write their memoirs. And of course they are writers by profession, so the writing is usually good. They have stories to tell that they couldn't tell at the time because of the libel laws. And they tell lots of jokes. So I was going to have short quotations from journalists' memoirs. And I thought, how could I illustrate this book? Well, obviously you would have photographs of famous journalists like de Blowitz of the Times or Walter Winchell in America. But I also thought I would have the front pages of newspapers from the 17th century onwards up to Gotcha in the Sun in 1982 when Britain sunk the Belgrano, the Argentinian cruiser. I went to a specialist dealer in Covent Garden who sold newspapers, and I came away with a rather expensive clutch of old newspapers. Now, one of them was the Daily Sketch of 1924, and the headline was, "The Honourable Mrs. Russell wins in the House of Lords." And there was a photograph of a very attractive woman in a cloche hat at the wheel of a sports car. So I read the story and thought, this is extraordinary. And I then went to the Times of the same date and got a more accurate account of what happened. And what happened was, in 1921, a baby was born to the Honourable Christabel Russell. The Honourable Christabel Russell, who was wife to the heir to a peerage. And the father refused to accept the baby was his, and obviously was saying his wife had had a lover. And she said, "Oh no, mate, it's yours." Because the fact was she wasn't very keen on sex. She had only allowed him what were called partial relations on her body. In other words, not penetration. But in my view, some of the right stuff got in the right place. And that baby was indeed the then heir to the barony of Ampthill. So the husband sued the wife through the divorce courts, but she won in what was then Britain's Supreme Court, the House of Lords. As a result, that baby, born in 1921, became a lord, Lord Ampthill. And in 2003, I wrote to him, and I said I would like to write a serious book about the Russell baby case. Well, I thought, he almost certainly will decline this offer because most families would like to hush up a scandal of this kind. However, I got a marvellous message on my answer machine. It went like this: "Hello, Geoffrey Ampthill here. I'm absolutely delighted you want to write this book. I thought I'd have to do it myself. I can't talk to you for very long. I'm due on the Woolsack in a moment or two." He was Deputy Speaker. Of the Deputy Lord Chancellor in the House of Lords. "I've looked you up on the House of Lords computer and seen your long list of books. Would you care to have lunch with me at the House of Lords next Tuesday?" And so of course I went, and I wore my darkest suit and I called him Sir, and we got on. He was about 83 then, and he agreed to give me full cooperation on this book. And he lent me photographs which are used in the book, letters of great intimacy from his mother, court transcripts. I was given the full works, and this is the first book that has ever appeared on the Russell baby case that really covers the thing in its fullest extent.
Were you already familiar with the intricacies of divorce law when you embarked on the book?
I can't say I was very familiar with the intricacies of divorce law. I'm a bachelor myself. But of course, I very quickly wised up. I'm not a lawyer, but I used to share a flat in my 20s with a man who later became a Lord Justice of Appeal. And I took advice from him about law, about the laws in this case.
As a direct result of the Russell baby case, English law was changed. Can you explain what happened?
Yes. King George V, who was on the throne in the 1920s, was absolutely horrified at the coverage of this scandal in all the newspapers, and he thought any child could pick up, the Daily Sketch and read about these sensational revelations about sex. And he asked whether the case could be held in camera, in other words, in secret. And the reply to that was no, because the British public needs to know that there's no prejudice and that the thing is entirely open, in the open. A law was passed that lubricious details of the kind exposed in the Russell Baby case could no longer be exposed in the newspapers. You could only print the barest, baldest details of a divorce case. Actually, this law fell into disuse because I remember in my own youth the divorce case of the Duke and Duchess of Argyll in 1963. There was a nude, headless man in photographs, and it was a great scandal. And I have to tell you that the full details of that divorce case were indeed published in the newspapers. So by then, this new law that was passed as a direct result of the Russell Baby case, had fallen into disuse.
It was very brave of Christabel to press ahead with the case. Did she know it was going to cause such an uproar?
I think she must have been pretty clear that it was going to cause an uproar. It was brave of her, and of course it cost her money, potentially if she lost, and she did lose one of the cases, finally winning in the House of Lords. It could have cost her a huge amount. She ran a dress shop in Curzon Street in the West End of London, and I'm very admiring of her because, she ran a great business with 40 staff at one stage, and that would have made enough money to tide her through.
Still talking about Christabel, in her later years, was she fettered by her peers for having stood her ground?
Well, she was a force of nature, Christabel. I mean, some people liked her and some people thought she was too forceful and selfish. But I think in general people would have accepted that this was a remarkable woman in an age when men dominated absolutely. She took on some of the leading lawyers of the 1920s and she wiped the floor with them. I mean, there was a man called Sir John Simon, later Lord Simon, who resigned from the case because he didn't want to face Christabel anymore. There was one question from Sir Edward Marshall Hall. Christabel was alleged to have taken a bath in the West End flat of a man called Mayer, and he taxed her with this and said, "Don't you think it's rather indiscreet?" And she said, "Well, surely it's better to be indiscreet than dirty."
In your research, have you come across any other sponge babies?
No, no other sponge babies. And I'm very dubious that this baby was conceived in that manner.
Ah, so do you have theories about...
Well, I think it's rather unlikely that a woman takes a bath and uses a sponge that her husband has used for what was described as an unworthy purpose, and that creates a baby. But anything is possible. It was alleged that a bullet passed through a man's testicles and went into a woman's vagina, and she conceived through that.
How come an Art Deco aficionado like yourselves lives in a 15th century former hospital?
Well, when I was at Oxford, I had a friend in my college who was the son of a GP, a doctor in Winchester, and he invited me and two others to stay. And the first full day, he drove us to the Hospital of St. Cross, and we were shown round by a marvellous old brother, a real old cockney, whose line of patter was something like, "And here is the old pump, and when the old brothers would pump and pump, what you think come out as well as water? Fish, what they probably have with chips for their dinner." And I'm very sorry to tell you, we got the giggles, and I felt very ashamed afterwards because he was only doing his best. But at the same time as I was laughing, I was looking around and thinking, I might want to come here one day. And when I was 59, you have to be 60 to get here, I wrote to the then master and said, "What a wonderful, tranquil place. I'm sure you have a long waiting list. Could I be added to it?" And eventually I became a brother, as we're called here.
So what what are your hopes for the book?
Well, naturally, I hope it will be a runaway bestseller and get rave reviews from everyone. But one hope I have is it might be turned into a Hollywood feature film, or at the very least a television miniseries. One of the people who knew Christabel Russell in old age was Angelica Houston in Ireland, and she has written me a marvellous paragraph or two about Christabel in those days. Now, I think Angelica might find a producer who would be willing to take on this amazing courtroom drama as it is. I can see it being a great Hollywood film. I'd like to see Keira Knightley in the role of young Christabel, for example.